Hey guys, tonight let's step back into an era where life and death were closer than we can imagine, and grief transformed into something beautiful, bizarre, maybe a little creepy. Before you drift off, if you enjoy exploring history's darker corners, please like and subscribe, it truly helps. Now, dim the lights, find a soft spot, and let's ease into the fascinating, unsettling world of Victorian mourning. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time is it in your corner of the world right now. Let us draw back the heavy velvet curtains on the Victorian era, a time often painted in sepia tones of stern portraits and quaint gaslit streets. But beneath this veneer of propriety and progress lay a starker reality, a world where life felt extraordinarily fragile and brief. Death was not an abstract concept, relegated to sterile hospital rooms and hushed conversations, as it often is today. Instead, it was an undeniable, ever-present companion, shaping society, family life, and the very way people understood their existence. The shadows in Victorian England were long, and many were cast by the constant presence of mortality, a silent observer in every home, on every street. To be born a Victorian was to enter a lottery where the odds of reaching even middle age were dauntingly slim, particularly if you weren't among the privileged few. Average life expectancy at birth hovered around a mere 40 years for men and 42 for women in the mid-19th century, a truly sobering figure. While these numbers did slowly climb, reaching closer to 45 for men and 50 for women by the century's close, they masked a harsher truth. If a child survived the treacherous early years, their chances of living to an older age improved significantly. Yet, the journey through infancy and childhood was a perilous path, one that many, tragically, would not complete. The air itself, in the burgeoning, often overcrowded cities of Victorian England, often seemed thick with unseen threats and miasmas. Infectious diseases were rampant, reaping a grim harvest across all sections of society, though the poor suffered disproportionately from their ravages. Tuberculosis, often romanticized as consumption, was perhaps the most relentless, a slow, wasting illness that claimed countless lives, casting a long shadow of fear. Cholera, swift and terrifying, could decimate a community within days, its sudden outbreaks a source of widespread panic. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water and food, was another common scourge, a constant reminder of the precariousness of basic sanitation. For Victorian children, the world was particularly fraught with immediate danger from invisible foes. Diseases that are now largely preventable through vaccination were then common executioners of the young and vulnerable. Scarlet fever, with its telltale rash and severe complications, swept through nurseries, leaving devastation and heartbreak in its wake. Measles, often dismissed today as a mild childhood illness, could be deadly in an era without supportive medical care. Diphtheria, known as the strangling angel, brought a terrifying and often fatal obstruction to breathing. Whooping cough, with its prolonged, violent fits, exhausted the small bodies of its victims relentlessly. The sheer scale of infant and child mortality in the Victorian era is difficult for us to truly comprehend today with our modern medical advances. Statistics from the time reveal a heartbreaking reality. It was not uncommon for around 1 in 5 children to die before their first birthday. In the poorest urban districts or within the grim walls of workhouses, this figure could be shockingly higher, sometimes as many as 1 in 2. Imagine the immense weight of that sorrow, the constant anxiety for your offspring. Even prominent families were not spared. Archbishop Attire, for example, tragically lost 5 of his young children to scarlet fever within a mere 5 weeks in 1856. This was not an isolated anomaly, but a shared, devastating feature. Unlike our modern tendency to medicalize and institutionalize the end of life, death in the Victorian era was most often a domestic event, occurring within familiar surroundings. The home was the scene of both arrival and departure, of birth and of the final breath. When illness struck, it was typically family members, particularly women, who undertook the difficult task of nursing the sick and dying. They would sit by the bedside, offering what comfort they could, witnessing firsthand the progression of disease and the quiet, or sometimes agonizing, transition from life to death. This intimate proximity to mortality shaped a very different understanding of its place in the cycle of life. Indeed, in this era, death wasn't whispered about in hushed tones or hidden behind closed doors. It was, in many ways, a constant houseguest and acknowledged presence. Its rituals were observed, and its impact openly displayed for all to see. The sight of a hearse, the mournful tolling of a church bell, the drawn blinds of a household in grief, these were familiar, almost daily occurrences. Loss was a thread woven deeply into the fabric of community life, discussed and shared. This familiarity did not necessarily lessen the pain of grief, but it did mean that death occupied a more visible and accepted place in the collective consciousness. The rapid, often chaotic growth of cities during the Industrial Revolution created environments where disease could flourish with alarming ease. Overcrowding was endemic, with many families crammed into poorly constructed, ill-ventilated tenements, offering little comfort or hygiene. Basic sanitation, as we understand it, was a luxury few could afford or access. Clean water was scarce, often drawn from polluted rivers like the Thames, which also served as an open sewer for human and industrial waste. Cesspools in basements or courtyards frequently overflowed, seeping into the ground. The infamous Great Stink of London in 1858, when the Thames stench overpowered Parliament, vividly illustrates the dire state of urban hygiene. For much of the Victorian era, the prevailing scientific understanding of how diseases spread was rooted in the miasma theory, a widely accepted notion. This theory held that illnesses like cholera, typhoid, and even influenza were caused by bad air, foul smells, or poisonous vapors from decaying organic matter, swamps, or general filth. While incorrect, this belief did, at times, lead to some positive public health interventions. Efforts to clean streets, improve drainage, and remove refuse were often motivated by a desire to eliminate these noxious miasmas. Though the reasoning was flawed, these actions sometimes inadvertently reduced actual sources of infection. The latter half of the 19th century witnessed a monumental shift in understanding disease. With the groundbreaking work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, their research laid the foundations for germ theory, the idea that specific microscopic organisms, bacteria and viruses, were responsible for causing specific diseases. This was a revolutionary concept, challenging centuries of medical belief and practice. However, the acceptance and application of germ theory were not immediate. It took time for these new ideas to permeate the medical establishment, and for their profound implications for hygiene and sanitation to be fully embraced by professionals and the public. Even as scientific understanding slowly advanced, the practical ability of Victorian medicine to cure or even effectively treat most serious illnesses remained severely limited. A frustrating reality for both patient and practitioner. Doctors, though often dedicated, had few truly effective tools at their disposal against the major killers. Treatments for common ailments frequently involved harsh measures like bloodletting or purging. Based on ancient theories of humoral imbalance, patent medicines, widely advertised and unregulated, offered countless concoctions that were usually ineffective and sometimes dangerous, containing alcohol, opium, or even mercury. For the majority, access to a physician was a financial burden, and the doctor was often more a witness to suffering than a bringer of cures. Victorian hospitals were far removed from the gleaming, sterile environments we expect today, often inspiring more fear than hope. For much of the century, they were often seen by the poor as places to go to die rather than to be healed, a last resort. Overcrowding was common, and with limited understanding of infection control, particularly before the widespread adoption of antiseptic practices by figures like Lister, hospitals could be breeding grounds for disease. The very act of entering a hospital carried significant risks of contracting something new. The pioneering efforts of Florence Nightingale, championing sanitary reforms and professional nursing, began to transform these institutions, but this was a gradual, hard-won process. Beyond the pervasive threat of infectious disease, the burgeoning Industrial Revolution introduced its own set of dangers that contributed to the fragility of Victorian life and health. Factories, mines, and mills were often perilous environments, with long hours, exhausting labor, and minimal safety regulations for the workers. Accidents were frequent, leading to injury, disability, or death, with little recourse for the afflicted. Exposure to pollutants and hazardous materials in the workplace also took a toll on health, leading to chronic respiratory illnesses and other occupational diseases. This constant backdrop of physical risk added another layer to life's precariousness. It is through this lens of constant, unavoidable proximity to death that we must view Victorian society, for it stands in such stark contrast to many Western cultures today, where death is often sanitized and hidden. In our modern world, death is often medicalized, occurring primarily in hospitals or care facilities, largely removed from everyday sight. Conversations about mortality can be uncomfortable, avoided, or couched in euphemisms. We strive to shield children from its realities, and public displays of grief are often subdued. For the Victorians, however, death was an intrinsic part of life's tapestry, an event that, while sorrowful, was met with a degree of acceptance and a structured public response. Given this almost unceasing familiarity with loss, it is perhaps unsurprising that grief occupied such a central and visible place in Victorian life. When death visited a family, which it did with such heartbreaking regularity, the experience of sorrow was not a private affair to be quickly overcome and hidden away. Instead, it was a shared, public, and often protracted process, guided by complex social codes and stringent expectations. There was a societal understanding that grief was a profound and necessary response to loss. It was not only an emotional outpouring, but also a social, and for many, a deeply significant religious duty that required outward expression. This world, so saturated with the presence of death, where every family knew loss intimately and where medicine offered few shields, naturally cultivated a profound and visible culture of remembrance and ritual. The high mortality rates, the ever-present threat of disease, the limited understanding of its causes, and the public nature of dying all contributed to a society that did not shy away from acknowledging sorrow. It was this very environment, this constant, almost tangible awareness of life's fragility, that laid the deep and intricate foundations for the elaborate mourning customs we will explore. As we continue our journey into the Victorian understanding of death, we now turn our attention from the sheer presence of mortality to the intricate and often bewildering ways in which society dictated its remembrance. The Victorians didn't just grieve, they navigated a complex labyrinth of rules, a meticulously crafted etiquette of sorrow that governed every facet of a mourner's life, often for years on end. This wasn't a private affair, left to individual discretion, but a public performance, scrutinized and judged by all. Imagine a world where your clothing, your social interactions, even the paper you wrote letters on were all strictly prescribed by your state of bereavement. This was the reality for many in the 19th century, particularly for women. The rules were detailed, often burdensome, and reflected a society deeply preoccupied with outward appearances, social hierarchy, and the proper visible expression of every emotion, especially grief. To deviate was to risk social censure, to be deemed unfeeling or disrespectful to the departed. These elaborate mourning customs didn't spring from nowhere. They were amplified by a confluence of factors. The high mortality rates we've discussed, a prevailing religious sentiment that emphasized remembrance and the afterlife, and perhaps most significantly, the profound and very public mourning of Queen Victoria herself. After the death of her beloved Prince Albert in 1861, the Queen plunged into a deep mourning that lasted for the remaining 4 decades of her life, setting a somber and influential precedent for her subjects across the empire. Her extended grief, visible in her perpetual black attire, inadvertently solidified and even intensified many of the mourning practices already taking shape. What might have been customs followed by the upper classes gradually permeated middle-class society and were aspired to, if not always perfectly replicated, by those with more modest means. Mourning became not just a personal sorrow, but a societal expectation, a hallmark of respectability and refined sensibility, heavily influenced by the monarch on the throne. The Victorian period of mourning was not a monolithic experience. It was carefully divided into distinct stages, each with its own set of rules and a prescribed duration that varied according to one's relationship to the deceased. The most intense and restrictive of these was known as deep mourning, or first mourning. For a widow, this period was the longest and most demanding, typically lasting for a year and a day, and sometimes extending to 2 full years. During deep mourning, a widow was expected to live in near seclusion. Her world shrank, her social interactions became severely limited, and her attire was the starkest symbol of her loss. She was in essence enveloped in a shroud of grief, both literally and figuratively. This initial period was designed to demonstrate the profound depth of her sorrow and her complete devotion to the memory of her departed husband, a time for intense reflection and minimal engagement with the outside world. Following deep mourning came the stage of second mourning. This period, which might last for another 9 months to a year, allowed for a gradual relaxation of the structures. The widow could begin to re-engage, albeit cautiously, with society. The oppressive weight of the initial grief, as reflected in her dress and conduct, was permitted to lighten, though her status as a mourner remained clearly defined. It was a transitional phase, moving from profound isolation towards a more ordinary, though still somber, existence. Finally, there was ordinary mourning, sometimes referred to as half-mourning. This concluding stage, typically lasting from 3 to 6 months, saw further easing of the rules. The mourner could introduce more variation in their dress, incorporate lighter colors, and participate more freely in social life. For a widow, this might mean the end of her prescribed mourning period, though some, like Queen Victoria, chose to remain in some form of mourning indefinitely. The transition through these stages was a slow, carefully managed return to the world. The duration of these stages, and indeed the necessity to observe them, was intricately tied to kinship. While a widow faced the longest and most severe requirements, a widower's formal mourning period was considerably shorter, often 6 months to a year, with a quicker return to normal life and business. This disparity reflected the differing social roles and expectations placed upon men and women in Victorian society, where women were seen as the primary bearers of emotional and domestic piety. Parents mourning the loss of a child were expected to observe a mourning period of about 1 year. Children mourning a parent would also typically mourn for a year. For siblings, the period was around 6 months. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and even more distant relatives or close friends for whom one might wear complementary mourning had shorter, less demanding periods, perhaps a few weeks to 3 months. Every death in a family could reset the clock or require adjustments to one's current stage of mourning, leading to prolonged periods in black. The cornerstone of Victorian mourning etiquette and its most visible manifestation was undoubtedly the clothing. For women, in particular, the rules governing mourning attire were incredibly detailed and exacting. The dominant color, of course, was black, but not just any black. During the deepest stages of mourning, the black had to be dull, completely devoid of luster or shine, symbolizing the darkness of grief and the absence of worldly vanity. The quintessential fabric of first mourning, especially for widows, was crepe. This was a stiff silk fabric with a distinctive crimped or crinkled texture, achieved through a heat-setting process. It was almost exclusively black and had a uniquely lifeless, lusterless quality that made it the perfect symbolic material for deep sorrow. Crepe was used extensively for entire dresses, for heavy trimmings, for bonnets, and most notably, for long enveloping veils. Imagine being swathed head to toe in this fabric. Crepe was not only somber in appearance, but also notoriously uncomfortable. It was scratchy against the skin, heavy, and prone to damage from rain or moisture, which would cause it to lose its crispness and become limp. Yet, its use was virtually mandatory for those adhering to the strictest codes of mourning. The sheer ubiquity of crepe meant that an entire industry, notably dominated by firms like Cordals, grew around its production. Besides crepe, other dull black fabrics were permissible in the early stages. Bombazine, a twilled fabric often made from a combination of silk and wool or sometimes cotton and wool, was a common choice. Parramatta cloth, similar to bombazine but often lighter, along with various wools like serge or merino, were also used. The key was the absence of shine. Materials like satin, velvet, or any glossy silks were strictly forbidden during first mourning as they were considered too ostentatious and celebratory. A widow's mourning dress, often referred to as her widow's weeds, the term weeds, deriving from an Old English word for garment, was typically plain in style, devoid of elaborate decoration. Trimmings, if any, would be of crepe. The silhouette would conform to the prevailing fashions of the day, but always rendered in the appropriate somber materials. Even undergarments, though not visible, were sometimes expected to be plain and unadorned, though they were typically white linen. The mourning bonnet was another essential item, usually made of or heavily trimmed with black crepe. Attached to this would be the mourning veil. In deep mourning, the crepe veil was exceptionally long, sometimes reaching to the hem of the dress or even trailing on the ground. For the first few months, typically 3 to 6, a widow was expected to wear this thick veil down over her face when in public, a heavy curtain between her grief and the outside world. After this initial period of deepest seclusion, the front part of the veil might be permitted to be thrown back over the bonnet, though the long fall at the back remained. The sight of a woman shrouded in black, her features obscured by a dense crepe veil, became an iconic, if melancholic, image of the Victorian era. Could you imagine the sensory deprivation, the world viewed through such a dark, obscuring mesh for months on end? As a woman progressed into second mourning, the rules for her attire began to ease, albeit slowly. The amount of crepe could be reduced. Perhaps the heavy crepe trimmings on her dress would be lessened, or a lighter quality of crepe used. She might be allowed to introduce fabrics with a slight sheen, such as black silk, though still without vibrant patterns. The veil might become shorter or made of a lighter material like black net or tulle, rather than the heavy crepe. During this stage, a small degree of ornamentation might be permitted. Black trimmings of lace, ribbon, or embroidery could be added to dresses. The overall effect was still one of profound mourning, but with subtle hints that the most crushing weight of sorrow was beginning to lift. It was a visual signal of her slow journey back towards the light of ordinary life, a journey meticulously charted by the changing textures and details of her wardrobe. In half mourning, the transformation became more pronounced. The mourner could finally begin to incorporate colors other than black, though these were carefully restricted to muted shades: lavender, mauve, violet, and various tones of gray were considered acceptable. Combinations of black and white, sometimes referred to as magpie mourning, were also common during this period. The oppressive black began to recede, replaced by softer though still subdued hues. Fabrics could now include silks with more luster, and even subtle patterns might be permissible. Crepe would likely be entirely absent by this stage. Bonnets could be made of straw and trimmed with ribbons or flowers in the permissible mourning colors. The overall impression was one of quiet respect for the deceased, but also an acknowledgement that life was continuing and the mourner was gradually rejoining the social world. An essential accessory for many mourning women, particularly in the earlier stages, was the widow's cap. This was a small, close-fitting cap, usually made of white muslin or tarlatan, often with black ribbons or trimming. It was worn indoors, symbolizing her status and her grief, even within the privacy of her home. This simple white cap, peeking out from beneath a black bonnet when outdoors, was another distinct marker of widowhood. Jewelry was heavily restricted, especially during deep mourning. If any was worn, it had to be specifically mourning jewelry. The most characteristic material for this was jet, a type of lignite, which is a precursor to coal. This deep black, lightweight organic gemstone could be carved and polished into beads, brooches, earrings, and pendants. Whitby in Yorkshire, England, was the primary source for high-quality jet, and its artisans produced an enormous variety of mourning pieces. Aside from genuine jet, other black materials like vulcanite, a type of hardened rubber, bog oak, preserved in peat bogs, and even black glass, often called French jet, were used to create affordable mourning jewelry. Pieces were often somber and symbolic, featuring motifs like weeping willows, urns, or crosses. Sometimes they incorporated portraits or initials of the deceased. Imagine living like this for 2 years or even longer, all in black, adorned only with these symbols of loss. Hair jewelry also reached a peak of popularity during the Victorian era, serving as poignant mementos. Locks of the deceased's hair would be intricately woven, plaited, or curled, and then incorporated into brooches, rings, lockets, and watch fobs. These were deeply personal keepsakes, tangible connections to the loved one who had passed. In later stages of mourning, pearls, symbolizing tears, might be considered acceptable. For men, the requirements of mourning were far less onerous, reflecting their active role in public and professional life. A widower might wear a full black suit, often of broadcloth, with black gloves and a black crepe hat band on his top hat. A black armband was also a common signifier of bereavement. While expected to show due solemnity, men were generally not subjected to the same prolonged periods of social seclusion or the same elaborate and restrictive dress codes as women. They could usually return to their businesses and public engagements much sooner than their female counterparts. The visual burden of grief, the constant, pathetic public display of sorrow through attire, fell disproportionately on the shoulders of Victorian women. Men's mourning was more understated, a somber nod to loss rather than an all-encompassing identity. Their black suit, while respectful, did not necessarily set them apart in the same dramatic way a widow's full weeds did. Children, too, were expected to participate in mourning rituals, though the rules were generally less severe, especially for the very young. Upon the death of a parent or sibling, children would typically wear mourning clothes for a year. This often meant black dresses for girls and black suits or tunics for boys. As with adults, the fabrics would be plain and dull in the initial stages. For very young children, particularly infants, white clothing trimmed with black ribbons was often considered acceptable, even in deep mourning. This acknowledged their innocence and perhaps the belief that such young souls were closer to purity. At the funerals of unmarried young girls, it was also customary for attendees, and sometimes the coffin itself, to be adorned with white, symbolizing innocence and purity lost. The act of mourning in the Victorian era was not merely a private emotional experience, it was a highly public and performative affair. The meticulous adherence to dress codes was just one aspect of this. A mourner's behavior, their social interactions, and even their correspondence were all subject to scrutiny and unspoken or sometimes overtly stated rules. Showing the correct amount of grief in the correct way was paramount for maintaining social standing. During the deepest stages of mourning, especially for a widow, a period of almost complete seclusion from society was expected. This meant refraining from attending parties, balls, theatrical performances, or any form of public entertainment. Social calls were limited to very close family or those offering condolences. To be seen engaging in frivolous activities too soon after a bereavement would invite severe criticism and accusations of disrespect for the dead. Even personal correspondence had its own set of mourning conventions. Stationery would be edged with a black border, The thickness of this border often indicated the depth of mourning or the closeness of the relationship to the deceased. Initially, the border would be quite wide, gradually narrowing as the mourner progressed through the stages of mourning. Black sealing wax was also used for letters during this time, another subtle but significant marker of grief. The pressure to conform to these expectations was immense. Etiquette manuals of the day, such as Cassell's Household Guide or The Habits of Good Society, dedicated extensive sections to the minutiae of mourning, providing detailed instructions on everything from the appropriate depth of crepe trim to the correct duration for using black and white calling cards. These guides served as arbiters of taste and propriety, reinforcing the societal norms. Failure to adhere to these complex rules could lead to social ostracism. Gossip was a powerful force, and a family's reputation could be damaged if they were perceived as not showing sufficient respect for their dead. This pressure was felt across social classes, though the ability to fully comply with the more expensive aspects of mourning, such as purchasing entire new wardrobes of black clothing, was often a marker of wealth and status. Indeed, mourning often became a performative art form in itself. The visible display of grief, the somber clothing, the downcast eyes, the restricted social life was a way of communicating one's sensibility, one's depth of feeling, and one's adherence to societal values. It was a language understood by all, a set of signals that conveyed respect, loss, and social propriety. The authenticity of the inner feeling was almost secondary to the correctness of the outward show. This intense focus on the material culture of mourning naturally spurred a significant industry. Mourning warehouses became prominent fixtures in major cities. Establishments like Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse in Regent Street or Peter Robinson's Black Peter Robinson in Oxford Street specialized in providing everything a grieving family might need, often at very short notice. These were essentially department stores dedicated to death. These emporiums stocked a vast array of goods, ready-made mourning clothes in all sizes and for all stages of grief, bolts of crepe and bombazine, black bonnets, veils, gloves, mourning jewelry, black-edged stationery, and even funeral accoutrements. They advertised mitigated grief or correct mourning, promising to alleviate the bereaved of the practical burdens of outfitting themselves and their households appropriately, allowing them to focus on their sorrow, or at least its proper presentation. The existence of such specialized businesses highlights how commercialized grief had become. While providing a necessary service in a society bound by such strict codes, these warehouses also profited from loss. The constant need for new mourning attire as old garments became unsuitable for later stages or as new bereavements occurred ensured a steady stream of customers. It was unlucky to keep mourning clothes in the house once they were no longer needed, further fueling consumption. Looking back, the sheer intensity and rigidity of Victorian mourning etiquette can seem almost overwhelming, a far cry from the more individualized and often private ways many cultures approach grief today. The weight of expectation, particularly on women, to physically embody sorrow for such extended periods, to have their lives so thoroughly circumscribed by loss, is a testament to a very different relationship with death and societal norms. Yet, amidst the performative aspects and the oppressive rules, these customs also provided a clear structure for grieving. They offered a defined path through sorrow, a public acknowledgement of loss that perhaps, for some, provided a framework for navigating the disorienting experience of bereavement. The shared rituals, however burdensome, also created a sense of communal understanding and support, a society that, in its own way, made very visible space for the presence of death and the expression of grief. The dark heart of Victorian grief was indeed unveiled for all to see in every rustle of black crepe. In our previous exploration of Victorian sorrow, we delved into the intricate rules and rituals that governed public grieving. Now, we journey deeper, beyond the outward displays of mourning attire and social etiquette, into a more personal, yet equally pervasive, aspect of the Victorian relationship with death, the tradition of Memento Mori. This Latin phrase, translating to "remember you must die," was not a new concept in the 19th century, but the Victorians embraced it with a particular fervor, weaving its sentiment into the very fabric of their lives through tangible, everyday objects. It was a whisper from antiquity that found a resounding echo in the heart of the industrial age. The idea of Memento Mori has ancient roots, echoing through the halls of Stoic philosophy in Greece and Rome, where thinkers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius contemplated mortality not to foster despair, but to appreciate life more fully and to live virtuously. The famous legend, though perhaps apocryphal, of a slave whispering, "Respis poste hominum te boni momento," Memento Mori, look behind you, remember that you are a man, remember that you will one die, into the ears of a triumphant Roman general during his victory parade, underscores this ancient awareness of human limitations, even amidst the pinnacle of glory. This potent reminder of life's fragility and the inevitability of death then found fertile ground in medieval Christianity. The Church actively promoted the contemplation of death, judgment, heaven, and hell as a means to encourage piety and a focus on spiritual salvation over worldly vanities. The Ars Moriendi, or the Art of Dying, were popular texts that offered guidance on how to achieve a good death. An imagery of the Danse Macabre, the dance of death, depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, from popes to peasants, to their graves, emphasizing death as the great leveler. Throughout the Renaissance and Baroque periods, Memento Mori continued to flourish, with profound artistic and intellectual expression. Skulls became almost a fashionable motif, appearing in portraits alongside scholars and nobles, a sober reminder of the ephemeral nature of human knowledge and power. Hourglasses meticulously marked the passage of time, each grain of sand a moment slipping away. Wilting flowers and decaying fruit in still-life paintings, particularly in the Vanitas, genre that blossomed in the Netherlands, poignantly symbolized the fleeting beauty of life and the transience of earthly pleasures and achievements. These were not meant to be solely morbid, but rather to encourage a more profound, spiritually aware engagement with life, urging one to look beyond the superficial. Fast forward to the 19th century, and this age-old concept found a unique and powerful resonance within the Victorian mindset. The constant, undeniable presence of death, which we have previously explored, made mortality an inescapable daily reality. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid, influenza, and tuberculosis swept through communities, and infant and child mortality rates were heartbreakingly high. This lived experience, combined with deeply held religious beliefs that emphasized divine judgment, the resurrection, and the hope of an afterlife, meant that the sentiment of Memento Mori was not just a distant philosophical abstraction, but a guiding principle that helped individuals navigate a world fraught with loss and uncertainty. For the Victorians, Memento Mori was not merely a passive acknowledgement of death's certainty, it became an active practice of remembrance, a deeply ingrained cultural habit. It was a way to keep loved ones close in spirit even after they had physically departed, and a constant, albeit often gentle, prompt to contemplate one's own eventual end and the state of one's soul. This era saw a distinct shift where the abstract idea was translated into a multitude of physical objects, each serving as a tangible link to the departed and a poignant reminder of mortality. These weren't always somber pronouncements of doom, but often deeply personal tokens of love, faith, and continued connection. These reminders, unlike in many contemporary Western cultures which tend to sanitize and distance death, were not hidden away in shame or fear. Instead, the Victorians integrated these objects into their daily lives, their homes, their personal adornment, and even their public spaces. The intent, as they perceived it, was rarely a morbid fascination with the macabre for its own sake, but rather a heartfelt, often sentimental desire to remember, to honor, and to maintain a sense of continuity with those they had lost. It was a way of domesticating death, of making its presence manageable and meaningful. The Romantic movement, which preceded and overlapped with the early Victorian era, also played a part in shaping this sensibility. Romanticism, with its emphasis on emotion, individualism, the beauty of nature, even in its decaying forms, and a fascination with ruins and the past, created a cultural atmosphere where melancholy and contemplation of life's great mysteries, including death, were considered signs of refined sensibility. This prepared the ground for the Victorians' more formalized and object-sanctified expressions of Memento Mori. One of the most public and enduring expressions of Memento Mori was found in the burgeoning Victorian cemetery. Far from being merely utilitarian burial grounds hidden on the outskirts of towns, these spaces became elaborate, thoughtfully designed landscapes of remembrance. The 19th century witnessed the rise of the rural cemetery movement, a significant shift driven by both public health concerns, moving burials out of overcrowded and unsanitary city churchyards, and by changing aesthetic and sentimental ideals. Pioneering cemeteries like Père Lachaise in Paris and later Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, and Highgate Cemetery in London were conceived as tranquil park-like settings. They featured winding paths, picturesque landscaping with carefully chosen trees and shrubs, serene water features, and carefully considered vistas. These were not just places for the dead, they became destinations for the living, for quiet contemplation, for respectful family outings, and even for moral improvement, as the beauty of nature and the art of the monuments were intended to inspire lofty thoughts. Within these garden cemeteries, the grave markers themselves evolved into intricate works of art, each stone surface rich with symbolic Memento Mori imagery, creating a silent, enduring narrative of loss and hope. An urn, often classically styled and sometimes draped with a stone-carved cloth, signified death and the separation of the soul from the body, the cloth representing the veil between worlds. This ancient motif, harking back to Greek and Roman practices, was revived with great popularity, speaking to the Victorian era's neoclassical tastes. The weeping willow tree, with its gracefully drooping branches, was a ubiquitous symbol carved in stone representing sorrow, mourning, and nature's lament for the departed. A broken column or a truncated obelisk often marked the grave of someone whose life was perceived as cut short, a life of promise unfulfilled. A particularly poignant symbol for young adults, a ship's anchor might signify hope or steadfastness in faith, or perhaps the grave of a mariner. Angels, in a myriad of poses, weeping over a tomb, pointing heavenward with an assuring gaze, or gently carrying the soul of the deceased, often depicted as a child, were incredibly common, symbolizing divine messengers, protectors, and guides to the afterlife. Clasped hands, sometimes with subtly differentiated cuffs to indicate male and female, might represent a final earthly farewell, the enduring bond of marriage, or the hopeful anticipation of reunion in heaven. The specific way the hands were clasped could even indicate who died first. Lambs, as previously mentioned, were frequently and tenderly used on the graves of infants and young children, symbolizing their innocence, gentleness, and Christ as the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God. Doves, often depicted with an olive branch, symbolized peace, purity, or the Holy Spirit. Even the types of flowers carved into the stone carried specific meanings in the highly developed Victorian language of flowers, or floriography. Roses signified love, lilies, purity and resurrection, forget-me-nots, remembrance, and ivy, fidelity or eternal life. These elaborate tombstones were far more than simple markers of identity. They were public declarations, sermons in stone, tangible reminders of the deceased individual, the universal fragility of human life, and the prevailing hope of Christian resurrection. Families would make regular, almost ritualistic visits to these graves, tending to them with care, leaving fresh flowers, and using the tranquil, symbolic environment as a dedicated space to connect with their memories, to grieve openly, and to contemplate their own mortality and spiritual standing. The cemetery itself became a vast, outdoor gallery of Memento Mori, a place where art, nature, and memory intertwined. Beyond the public and communal space of the cemetery, Memento Mori found intensely personal and often poignant expression in the realm of mourning jewelry. As we touched upon in our previous chapter, jewelry played a crucial and highly visible role in the Victorian mourning ritual, and many of these pieces were designed specifically with the intent to keep the memory of the deceased physically close, a constant, wearable reminder. Lockets, of course, were immensely popular, treasured for their intimate nature. However, it is important to reiterate that, contrary to some modern assumptions, these lockets very rarely contained the ashes of the deceased in the Victorian era. Formal cremation, though debated and experimented with, was not legally sanctioned in Britain until 1884 and only gained slow acceptance thereafter. It remained uncommon for much of the period. The primary and most cherished contents of these memorial lockets, brooches, and rings were locks of hair. A lock of a loved one's hair, a soft curl from an infant, a treasured tress from a spouse, or a distinguished strand from a parent was considered a profoundly personal and precious relic. Hair, unlike flesh, does not readily decay. It retains its color and texture for decades, even centuries, making it a remarkably enduring physical remnant of the person. This hair would be carefully preserved, often intricately plaited, twisted, woven into complex patterns, or even ground into a powder, to be used as a pigment in miniature sepia paintings, all typically sealed under glass within the piece of jewelry. Artisans who specialized in hair work became highly skilled, creating breathtakingly delicate and complex designs. Palette work involved arranging strands of hair into feathery, plume-like shapes or floral motifs. Table work involved weaving hair on a specialized table to create braids, tubes, or flat bands that could be fashioned into bracelets, necklaces, or watch chains. These weren't just simple strands. They were miniature works of art, testament to both the skill of the jeweler and the depth of the sentiment. Sometimes the hair of several family members, living and deceased, would be lovingly combined in one piece, symbolizing enduring family ties and the continuity of generations. Wearing a piece of hair jewelry was an act of profound love and remembrance, a way of carrying a tangible part of the lost loved one with you always, feeling their presence against your skin. It was a memento mori that spoke not just of death, but of enduring connection, love, and the preciousness of human relationships. The warmth of the body against the locket or brooch was thought to keep the memory warm as well. Yet the deep black, fossilized wood, primarily sourced from Whitby in Yorkshire, England, was, as we've discussed, the preeminent material for mourning jewelry. Its somber, lusterless black perfectly embodying the gravity of grief. It was lightweight and easily carved into beads, intricate cameos featuring classical or mourning scenes, elaborate brooches, earrings, and pendants. Often these jet pieces would incorporate symbolic memento mori designs, forget-me-nots for remembrance, ivy for everlasting life or unwavering fidelity, a sheaf of wheat for a long life harvested, or hands clasped in farewell. Queen Victoria's extensive and lifelong use of Whitby jet jewelry after Prince Albert's death in 1861 further cemented its status as the epitome of fashionable grief. Miniature portraits of the deceased were another common and cherished feature in mourning jewelry, often meticulously painted on slivers of ivory or porcelain and set into lockets, brooches, rings, or bracelets. These tiny, detailed likenesses, sometimes startlingly realistic, allowed the wearer to keep the beloved face of their loved one close to their heart, a constant visual reminder. Sometimes these portraits were commissioned while the person was alive, but often, especially if no living portrait existed or if the death was sudden, they were created post-mortem, sometimes from memory or from a death mask, serving as an especially precious final image to cling to. The deep-seated desire to capture a final likeness of the departed also led to one of the most poignant and, to modernize, perhaps most unsettling Victorian memento mori practices, post-mortem photography. In an age before personal cameras and casual snapshots were commonplace, a photograph might be the only visual record a family possessed of a loved one, particularly an infant or a young child who died suddenly before other portraits could be made. The advent of photography with the daguerreotype in 1839, followed by ambrotypes, tintypes, and later the more affordable cartes de visite, made it possible to obtain a true-to-life, if somewhat stark image, a powerful and enduring tool for remembrance. Post-mortem photographs, also known as memorial portraits or bereavement photography, were taken with great care and sensitivity considering the solemnity of the occasion. The deceased, especially children, were often posed as if they were merely peacefully sleeping, perhaps tucked into their beds or cradles, dressed in their best clothes, and sometimes accompanied by a favorite toy, a doll, a book, or carefully arranged flowers. The aim was often to present an image of serenity and innocence, to capture a final, peaceful look. In other instances, deceased children were photographed with their living family members, parents holding their lost child one last time, or siblings gathered around their departed brother or sister. These images, while profoundly heartbreaking, served as a final family portrait, a testament to the child's place within the family unit. Adults might be photographed in their coffins, often surrounded by elaborate floral tributes, or sometimes seated in a chair as if in quiet repose. Early photographic processes required long exposure times, making still subjects like the deceased easier to capture clearly than their living, fidgeting relatives, which sometimes adds an eerie clarity to the departed in group photos. While the sight of these images can be jarring, even disturbing, to contemporary sensibilities, it's vital to understand that for the Victorians, they were deeply cherished and meaningful mementos. They provided a tangible image to grieve over, a way to preserve the precious features of a loved one before they inevitably faded from memory. These photographs were not seen as morbid curiosities or ghoulish displays, but as invaluable keepsakes, a testament to the depth of love and the pain of loss. In an era where death was an all-too-familiar visitor in the home, they were a powerful form of memento mori, freezing a final, beloved moment in time. The practice of creating death masks also served a similar, though perhaps more visceral, purpose of remembrance. A death mask is a plaster or wax cast made of a person's face shortly after their passing, capturing their features in 3 dimensions. This tradition dates back many centuries, used historically for creating royal effigies for state funerals, or as accurate aids for sculptors commissioned to create posthumous portraits or busts. In the Victorian era, death masks continued to be made for prominent individuals, writers, artists, statesmen, whose likenesses were deemed historically important. However, death masks were also sometimes commissioned by ordinary families as a deeply personal memento of their loved ones. These masks captured the exact contours of the face, the serene, or sometimes unsettlingly final expression of the departed. Unlike a photograph, a death mask offered a tactile, 3-dimensional representation that could be kept in the home, perhaps in a study or a private cabinet. While some masks of criminals or unknown persons were used for then-emerging scientific or pseudoscientific study, such as in the now discredited field of phrenology, which attempted to determine character from skull shape, for many families a death mask was a uniquely personal memento mori, a tangible sculpture of a face they would see no more, a direct impression of their loved one's final repose. Beyond these more overtly personal items, the pervasive sentiment of memento mori permeated other forms of domestic ephemera and household objects, subtly weaving reminders of mortality and remembrance into the daily environment. Memorial cards, as we've touched upon in our discussion of mourning stationery, were widely produced and circulated. These were small, printed cards, typically heavily bordered in black of varying widths and often embossed or printed with a rich iconography of death and mourning, weeping willows, urns draped in sorrow, broken columns, doves ascending, angelic figures, or poignant verses about loss and heavenly reunion. These cards would usually include the name of the deceased, their dates of birth and death, their age, and perhaps a short Bible verse, a sentimental poem, or a heartfelt expression of grief. They were sent to friends and relatives to formally announce a death and to provide details of the funeral service, but they also served a secondary purpose as lasting keepsakes. Recipients would often tuck these cards into family Bibles, prayer books, or specially designed albums, preserving them as tokens of remembrance. Funeral invitations themselves, often designed with similar somber aesthetics, also became mementos of the solemn occasion. Some families also created or commissioned mourning samplers or other memorial textiles. These pieces of embroidery, often stitched by female members of the family as an act of devotion and remembrance, might feature the names and vital dates of deceased loved ones, alongside traditional memento mori motifs such as tombstones, weeping figures, and verses on mortality or eternal life. These embroidered memorials would then be framed and displayed in the home, serving as a constant, handmade tribute. Even everyday items like handkerchiefs might feature black embroidered borders or mourning motifs when used during bereavement. Even small, seemingly mundane household considerations and customs could carry the weight of memento mori. For instance, the common Victorian custom of stopping the clocks in the house at the exact moment of a death, and sometimes leaving them stopped until after the funeral, served as a poignant marker of time halting for the departed. It was a symbolic gesture that underscored the finality of that individual's earthly existence, a reminder that their measure of time had run out. Similarly, the practice of covering mirrors with cloth, especially in the room where the deceased lay, was rooted partly in ancient superstitions, such as the fear that the deceased spirit might be trapped in the reflection, or that seeing one's own reflection at such a time might portend another death. But it also served the practical purpose of reducing worldly vanity and encouraging solemn reflection during a period of profound grief. It is undeniably true that many of these Victorian practices surrounding death and its remembrance can seem alien, even unsettling or overtly morbid to the modern observer. Contemporary Western culture, for the most part, strives to shield itself from the direct visual and physical reminders of mortality. Death is frequently medicalized, occurring primarily in hospitals or specialized care facilities, largely removed from the everyday sight and experience of the home environment. Its imagery is often considered private, if not entirely taboo in public discourse. We tend to favor discreet memorials, often focusing on celebrating the life lived rather than dwelling on the symbols of its cessation. The Victorian willingness to live so intimately with the emblems of death, to wear jewelry fashioned from the hair of the deceased, to commission photographs of their dead children, to fill their homes with mourning art and their cemeteries with elaborate symbolic monuments, can easily appear to us as a rather morbid preoccupation. A society seemingly obsessed with the macabre, we might instinctively recoil slightly or wonder at the psychological impact of being so constantly surrounded by such potent reminders of loss and finitude. Was it healthy, we might ask, to dwell so intensely on sorrow? Yet, it is crucial, if we are to understand the Victorians on their own terms, to attempt to perceive these practices within their specific historical, cultural, and spiritual context. For them, these memento mori objects and customs were not primarily about a morbid fascination with death itself, nor were they intended to prolong agony. Instead, they arose from, and spoke to, the enduring strength of human love, the deep need for tangible memory and the comforts of faith in the face of frequent and often overwhelming loss. In an era of high mortality, where families were routinely and repeatedly bereaved, these physical reminders provided comfort, a sense of continued connection, and a structured means of processing and expressing grief. The primary intent, from the Victorian perspective, was largely one of active loving remembrance, not of wallowing in sorrow for its own sake or cultivating a taste for the ghoulish. Keeping a lock of hair was an act of profound personal affection, a way to retain something uniquely of the person. Displaying a post-mortem photograph was often a desperate measure to ensure a child, perhaps one who had lived only a short time, was not forgotten, their image preserved for future generations. Visiting an ornate family grave was an act of piety, respect, and familial duty, reinforcing the bonds that death could not entirely sever. These objects and practices helped to keep the deceased alive in memory, integrated into the ongoing life of the family and community, rather than being abruptly erased or solely confined to abstract thought. They provided focal points for grief, allowing sorrow to be externalized and shared. Furthermore, in a society where religious convictions were generally strong and deeply ingrained, Memento Mori also served as a constant, gentle reminder of the spiritual dimension of human existence and the widely held belief in an afterlife and eventual heavenly reunion. Remembering that one must die was intrinsically linked to the exhortation to live a life worthy of eternal reward, to prepare one's soul for what was to come. The symbols of death, therefore, were often intricately intertwined with symbols of resurrection, eternal life, and heavenly peace, offering genuine solace and profound hope amidst the immediate pain of sorrow. The anchor symbolized hope, the butterfly resurrection, the evergreen ivy eternal life. These were not just decorations, but carriers of deep spiritual meaning. These objects also played a crucial, if informal, role in the grieving process itself. In a time before the advent of modern grief counseling or formal psychological support systems as we know them, these tangible acts of remembrance, meticulously creating intricate hair jewelry, patiently sitting for or arranging a post-mortem photograph, embroidering a memorial sampler with care, could be deeply therapeutic. They provided a focus for sorrow, a way to channel powerful emotions into creative, commemorative, and memorializing acts. They made grief visible, tangible, and to some extent shared, rather than a purely internal, silent, and potentially isolating experience. So when we encounter these Victorian memento mori, whether it's a delicate jet brooch holding a miniature portrait, a faded and poignant post-mortem photograph of a sleeping child, or an elaborately carved angel on a weathered tombstone, it's important to try to look beyond our initial modern reactions or preconceptions. These were not simply creepy or morbid artifacts of a bygone era, inexplicably obsessed with death. They were, more accurately, profound and multifaceted expressions of the universal human experience, of love that seeks to transcend death, of the deep-seated human need to remember and be remembered, and of the ongoing, timeless search for meaning, comfort, and connection in the face of mortality. The Victorians, by keeping death and its reminders so palpably close, so interwoven with the rituals and aesthetics of their daily lives, were perhaps more intimately and honestly acquainted with the full spectrum of human existence, including its inevitable and natural end. Their memento mori traditions, while sometimes startling or challenging to our contemporary sensibilities, reveal a culture that grappled openly and artistically with loss, seeking to integrate the memory of the dead into the world of the living in deeply personal, often beautiful, and highly symbolic ways. They understood, in a manner that we have perhaps largely forgotten, that to remember death was, in many crucial ways, to better understand, value, and cherish the precious, fleeting gift of life itself. Welcome. In our continuing quiet exploration of how Victorians engaged with death and remembrance, we now arrive at a practice that is perhaps one of the most uniquely personal and tangible, the art of human hair. This chapter, The Art of Hair, Intimate Keepsakes, delves into a world where strands of hair were transformed from mere biological filaments into exquisite, deeply symbolic works of art and jewelry, forming an intensely personal bridge between the living and the departed, or indeed between cherished, living individuals. The idea of using human hair in memorial objects was not entirely novel to the 19th century, with precedents stretching back to the 17th and 18th centuries. However, it was during the Victorian era that this practice reached its zenith, becoming a widespread and highly developed art form. It became an integral part of the elaborate mourning culture we have discussed, but also extended beyond grief into the realms of sentiment, love, and familial connection. The Victorians, with their profound appreciation for the sentimental and the symbolic, found in hair a medium unlike any other. Tonight, we will unravel the reasons behind hair's special significance, explore the incredibly intricate techniques employed by hair artists, both amateur and professional, and examine the diverse array of objects created from this most personal of materials. From delicate rings and brooches worn close to the skin, to elaborate wreaths proudly displayed in the home, hair art offered a unique way to hold on to a physical part of a loved one, making memory almost palpable. So, let us dim the lights a little further, settle in, and prepare to explore this fascinating and often deeply touching facet of Victorian material culture, where skill, patience, and profound emotion were intricately woven together. Why hair the perfect relic? What was it about human hair that made it such a compelling and widely used medium for keepsakes in the 19th century? Several key factors contributed to its profound significance. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, hair is undeniably uniquely personal. It is a physical part of an individual, carrying their essence, their very DNA. That in itself is as much a means, if not a way. Unlike a portrait or a written description, a lock of hair was once living, growing tissue from the person themselves, making it the ultimate personal relic. Secondly, hair possesses a remarkable durability. While the body decays, hair remains largely unchanged for decades, even centuries, if properly preserved. It does not easily fade or decompose, retaining its color and texture long after its owner has passed from the world. This quality of incorruptibility made it an ideal symbol of enduring memory and everlasting love, a steadfast reminder in a world where life itself often felt so fragile and fleeting. The symbolism of hair is also deeply resonant. Throughout history, hair has been associated with vitality, strength, think of Samson, identity, and beauty. A lock of hair given as a token of love or friendship was a powerful gesture, a sharing of one's physical being. In the context of mourning, preserving the hair of a deceased loved one was a way to hold on to a vestige of their physical presence, a comforting, tangible link to the person they had been. Furthermore, hair was a universally available material. Regardless of social status or wealth, everyone possessed hair. While the settings for hair jewelry, the gold, the pearls, the intricate enamel work, certainly reflected the owner's financial standing, the precious hair itself was democratic. A simple, lovingly plaited lock of a child's hair kept in a plain locket could hold just as much, if not more, emotional value as an elaborate, professionally crafted mourning brooch commissioned by a wealthy widow. This intrinsic value, combined with its pliability and potential for artistic manipulation, made hair the perfect medium for the Victorian era's burgeoning culture of sentimentality and remembrance. It could be hidden discreetly within a locket, or proudly displayed as a testament to enduring affection or profound grief. It was, in essence, the closest one could get to preserving a physical part of a person, making memory almost something one could touch and hold. The rise of hairwork in the Victorian era. While, as mentioned, sentimental jewelry incorporating hair existed before the 19th century, particularly in the Georgian era, with its neoclassical motifs like weeping willows and urns often depicted using hair, the Victorian period saw an explosion in its popularity and complexity. About the societal emphasis on elaborate mourning rituals, significantly amplified by Queen Victoria's own prolonged and public mourning for Prince Albert, created a fervent demand for mourning accoutrements, with hairwork taking center stage. Queen Victoria herself frequently commissioned and wore hair jewelry. She had pieces made containing Prince Albert's hair, as well as the hair of her children and other cherished family members. Her royal patronage lent a significant air of fashionability and propriety to the practice, encouraging its adoption across the middle and even aspiring working classes. What the Queen did, society often emulated with great enthusiasm. The romantic and sentimental tendencies of the age also fueled the desire for such intimate keepsakes. The Victorian era was a time of deeply felt emotions, or at least the elaborate expression of them. Love, friendship, and familial bonds were highly valued, and tokens that symbolized these connections were cherished. Hair jewelry and hair art served as tangible expressions of these powerful sentiments, not just in times of loss, but also to celebrate enduring relationships among the living. Magazines and ladies' journals of the period frequently published patterns and instructions for amateur hair work, allowing women to create these keepsakes in their own homes. This domestic crafting aspect further personalized the pieces, imbuing them with the time, care, and devotion of the maker. For many Victorian women, engaging in hairwork was a labor of love, a quiet, meditative act of remembrance or affection. Alongside this amateur pursuit, a professional industry of hair artists and jewelers flourished. These skilled artisans could execute incredibly complex designs, transforming tresses into miniature masterpieces. They advertised their services, offering to create custom pieces from hair provided by their clients, ensuring that even those lacking the time or skill for intricate crafting could possess these precious mementos. The demand was such that specialized tools and materials for hair work were widely available. Intricate techniques, a labor of love. The creation of Victorian hair art and jewelry was often an incredibly painstaking and meticulous process, demanding immense patience, a steady hand, and a keen eye for detail. Whether crafted by a loving amateur in the quiet of her parlor, or by a skilled professional in a bustling workshop, each piece represented a significant investment of time and care, making the finished object all the more precious. Several distinct techniques were employed, each with its own unique aesthetic. One of the most common methods, particularly for creating bands for bracelets, necklaces, watch chains, or rings, was known as table work. This involved meticulously weaving or braiding strands of hair, often over a mold or a core, to give it shape and consistency. Specialized tables with weighted bobbins, similar in principle to those used for lace making, were used to manage the numerous fine strands and achieve intricate, tight patterns. The resulting woven hair could be remarkably strong and possess a subtle, beautiful sheen. These woven bands could be round, flat, or tubular, and their patterns could range from simple plaits to incredibly complex multi-stranded weaves that resembled fine basketry or even metallic mesh. The hair would first be carefully cleaned, sorted by length and color, and then painstakingly arranged on the bobbins. The artist would then follow a pattern, methodically interlacing the strands to create the desired design. It was a slow, repetitive process that required intense concentration. Another highly developed technique was palette work, also sometimes referred to as hair painting, though it didn't always involve paint in the traditional sense. In palette work, strands of hair, often chopped into tiny pieces or curled into delicate tendrils, were carefully arranged with tweezers and secured with an adhesive, typically gum arabic, onto a base material such as ivory, mother of pearl, vellum, or glass. This allowed for the creation of pictorial designs. Common motifs in palette work included weeping willows drooping mournfully over urns or tombstones, feathers, plumes, Prince of Wales feathers, intertwined hearts, anchors for hope, doves for peace, and very frequently elaborate monograms or the full name of the individual being remembered. Tiny seed pearls, symbolizing tears, were often incorporated into these designs, as were delicate gold wires, known as PELs, or flakes of gold leaf to add highlights and definition. The effect could be incredibly delicate and painterly, resembling a miniature sepia drawing, but wrought from the actual hair of a loved one. A variation of this involved using dissolved hair. In this technique, hair was ground into a fine powder and then mixed with a binding medium, such as gum arabic or sepia paint, to create a pigment. This hair-based pigment could then be used by a miniature artist to paint delicate scenes, scrolls, or inscriptions. This method allowed for even finer detail than palette work with loose strands, but the direct physical connection to the hair itself was perhaps slightly more abstract, transformed as it was into a paint. The skill involved in these techniques was considerable, achieving smooth, even braids in table work or creating delicate legible monograms and recognizable symbols in palette work with something as fine and flyaway as human hair required not only artistic talent but also extraordinary dexterity and perseverance. Even the preparation of the hair itself, cleaning it, sorting it, ensuring it was free of oils was a crucial first step. Many instruction books published during the 19th century offered detailed guidance on these methods, complete with patterns and design suggestions. Self-Instructor in the Art of Hair Work, 1867, by Mark Campbell, was one such popular manual enabling women to undertake this sentimental craft at home. However, for more elaborate or professionally finished pieces, especially those involving complex gold settings or gemstone embellishments, the services of a specialist hair jeweler were indispensable. These artists, often unsung, transformed the deeply personal relic of human hair into enduring objects of beauty and sentiment. Each tiny curl glued into place, each strand carefully woven, was an act of devotion, a testament to the Victorian desire to keep their loved ones, literally and figuratively, close to their hearts. The resulting pieces were far more than mere trinkets. They were concentrated expressions of love, loss, and remembrance. Forms of hair jewelry, personal adornments. The techniques of hair work found expression in a wide array of personal adornments, catering to different tastes, occasions, and degrees of mourning or sentiment. Perhaps the most iconic and versatile piece of hair jewelry was the locket. Victorian lockets, often made of gold, silver, or rolled gold, were designed with one or more glazed compartments specifically intended to house a lock of hair, a miniature portrait, sometimes painted with dissolved hair, or a tiny, intricate hairwork design. These lockets could be worn on a chain around the neck, pinned as a brooch, or attached to a chatelaine. They were deeply personal, often kept closed, with their precious contents revealed only to the wearer or intimate friends. The exterior of the locket might be engraved with initials, dates, or mourning symbols like black enamel tracery, while the interior held its precious, tangible secret, a direct link to the person remembered. Brooches were another immensely popular form for showcasing hair art. Larger than lockets, they offered a more expansive canvas for elaborate palette work designs. A typical mourning brooch might feature a central glazed panel displaying a weeping willow crafted from hair, arching over a tombstone bearing the initials of the deceased, perhaps surrounded by a border of black enamel, jet, or seed pearl. Sentimental brooches exchanged between living friends or lovers might feature intertwined initials, floral motifs, or lovers' knots made of hair. Rings incorporating hair were also common, offering a more discreet yet constantly present reminder. Some rings featured a woven band made entirely of hair, a surprisingly resilient and comfortable form. Others had a small glazed bezel set with a tiny hairwork design, a miniature monogram, or a single carefully preserved curl. These rings were worn by both men and women, tangible symbols of connection on their very hands. Collars and bracelets made extensive use of table-worked hair. Intricate braids or woven tubes of hair were fashioned into drops for earrings, often capped with gold or jet findings. Bracelets could consist of multiple woven hair strands, sometimes interspersed with gold beads or charms, or feature a wider, flat band of woven hair with a central clasp that might itself contain a hair compartment, or a miniature. These pieces moved with the wearer, a constant, gentle reminder. Necklaces could also be fashioned from long, fine chains of table-worked hair, or featured pendants similar in style to brooches or lockets, holding intricate hair designs. The lightness and flexibility of woven hair made it suitable for these more flowing forms of adornment. Every element of a lady's parure, or matching set of jewelry, could potentially incorporate hairwork. For men, one of the most significant forms of hair jewelry was the watch fob or watch chain. In an era when pocket watches were ubiquitous for gentlemen, a chain crafted from the hair of a wife, child, or a deceased loved one was a common and cherished possession. These chains, often thick and elaborately braided using tablework, were both functional and deeply sentimental, kept close in a waistcoat pocket. Tie pins and cufflinks could also incorporate small glazed sections of hairwork. The settings for these hair jewels varied greatly in richness, depending on the means and taste of the owner. Gold was, of course, highly favored, often intricately chased or engraved. Black enamel was frequently used in mourning pieces to enhance their somberness. Jet, as mentioned, was paramount for deep mourning. Seed pearls symbolizing tears were often used to border hair compartments, especially in memory of children or young unmarried women. Sometimes more colorful gemstones might be incorporated in sentimental pieces not directly related to mourning. Many pieces of hair jewelry also bore inscriptions, further personalizing them. These could be found engraved on the reverse of a locket or brooch, or sometimes subtly incorporated into the design itself. Common inscriptions included names, initials, dates of birth and death, phrases like "in memoriam," not lost but gone before, "thy will be done," or more personal endearments. These words, combined with the hair itself, created a powerful and multi-layered token of remembrance. The sheer variety of forms that hair jewelry took speaks to its deep integration into Victorian life. It was not a niche craft, but a widespread cultural phenomenon, a readily understood visual language of love, loss, and enduring connection. Each piece, whether simple or elaborate, told a story, holding within its delicate strands the essence of a human relationship. Grander expressions, hair art for the home. Beyond the intimate scale of personal jewelry, the Victorian passion for hairwork also found expression in larger, more elaborate artistic creations designed for display within the home. These pieces often served as significant family memorials or collective expressions of sentiment, moving beyond individual adornment to become focal points of domestic remembrance. Chief among these were the remarkable hair wreaths. Hair wreaths were often incredibly complex, three-dimensional constructions meticulously crafted from the hair of multiple family members, both living and deceased. These wreaths were typically formed around a wire framework, often horseshoe-shaped, a symbol of luck, or perhaps a gateway, or circular, symbolizing eternity. Each individual flower, leaf, tendril, or abstract ornamental shape within the wreath would be painstakingly fashioned from human hair. The creation of a family hair wreath could be a communal and ongoing project, undertaken by the women of the household over many months or even years. As family members passed away, locks of their hair would be incorporated. Hair from living members, including children, perhaps from their first haircut, would also be added, creating a tangible genealogical tapestry. Different colors and textures of hair from various individuals would be artfully combined to create shading and visual interest in the floral or abstract designs. These wreaths were rich in symbolism. They represented the interconnectedness of the family tree, made literal through the physical medium of hair. They served as a powerful memento mori, a reminder of ancestors and deceased relatives, but also as a celebration of continuing family bonds. Once completed, these delicate and labor-intensive creations were almost invariably preserved under a protective glass dome, often displayed prominently on a parlor table or mantelpiece. The glass dome not only protected the fragile hairwork from dust and damage, but also transformed the wreath into a cherished domestic icon, a miniature shrine to family memory. Looking at such a wreath, a Victorian family member could see and touch, metaphorically, generations of their kin. It was a deeply personal and poignant form of ancestral veneration, made all the more powerful by the intimate nature of the material used. Besides wreaths, some artisans and dedicated amateurs created entire pictures composed of, or significantly incorporating, human hair. These hair pictures might depict landscapes, biblical scenes, floral arrangements, or symbolic motifs like anchors, crosses, or hearts. Palette work and dissolved hair painting techniques were employed on a larger scale to achieve these effects. These framed artworks would adorn the walls of Victorian homes, further integrating the theme of remembrance into the domestic environment. The patience and skill required to create these larger hair art pieces were immense. Imagine forming hundreds of tiny individual petals or leaves from fine strands of hair, each needing to be shaped, secured, and then assembled into a cohesive design. The sheer dedication involved speaks volumes about the importance placed on such acts of remembrance and the value attributed to these unique, handcrafted mementos. These larger pieces, especially the family wreaths, underscore the communal aspect of Victorian mourning and remembrance. While a locket might be a private token, a hair wreath was a shared family heirloom, a collective memento mori that told the story of a lineage through the most personal of all possible mediums. They stand today in museums and private collections as extraordinary testaments to Victorian sentimentality, artistry, and the profound desire to keep loved ones physically present in memory. The tools for creating these were often simple: fine scissors, tweezers, needles, molds for shaping flowers, adhesives, and the specialized tables for weaving. Yet, in skilled hands, these humble implements could transform something as ephemeral as a lock of hair into an enduring work of art, imbued with deep emotional significance and intricate beauty. Beyond mourning, sentimental hairwork. While hairwork is most famously and extensively associated with Victorian mourning practices, it is important to remember that its use was not exclusively funereal. Hair was also a powerful medium for expressing love, friendship, and affection between the living. These sentimental pieces, though perhaps less somber in their design, shared the same underlying principle, the desire to possess a tangible token of a cherished individual. Lovers frequently exchanged locks of hair as tokens of their devotion. A young man might carry a small packet containing his sweetheart's tress, or she might wear a ring or locket containing his hair. These exchanges were deeply romantic gestures, signifying intimacy and a pledging of selves. The hair served as a constant reminder of the absent beloved, a promise of fidelity. Friendship albums, popular in the 19th century, often contained not only handwritten verses and signatures, but also tiny, carefully arranged locks of hair from dear friends. These albums became treasure troves of sentimental connections. Similarly, brooches or bracelets might incorporate the hair of a close friend or a group of bosom friends, symbolizing their unbreakable bond. Family milestones also provided occasions for creating hair keepsakes. The hair from a baby's first haircut was often preserved, perhaps fashioned into a tiny curl set in a locket for the proud mother, or incorporated into a larger family hair wreath. As children grew, locks of their hair might be exchanged or preserved by parents and grandparents, marking the passage of time and the growth of the family. These non-mourning pieces might differ subtly in their symbolism and setting. While mourning jewelry was predominantly black, sentimental pieces could incorporate more gold-colored gemstones if affordable, and motifs like hearts, doves, or flowers with romantic connotations like forget-me-nots for true love, or roses. However, the underlying techniques of hair manipulation remain largely the same, showcasing the versatility of this unique art form. Examples and stories general/archetype. While it is challenging to pinpoint many individually famous pieces of hair art outside of royal collections or exceptionally well-documented museum examples, the archetypal stories these objects tell are universal and deeply moving. Imagine a young widow, shortly after the death of her husband, carefully taking a lock of his hair. She might spend her lonely evenings in the deep mourning period meticulously braiding that hair into a band for a locket, her tears perhaps mingling with her work. That locket, worn constantly over her heart, would be her most precious possession, a tangible comfort in her grief. Consider a mother who has lost an infant, a tragically common occurrence. The tiny, almost weightless curl of baby hair, perhaps the only substantial memento she has of her child's brief life, would be enshrined in a small brooch or ring. Each time she touched it, she would remember the softness, the fleeting presence of her lost child. This was not about morbidity, but about a desperate, loving need to hold on to something real. Picture a large, multi-generational family, perhaps in a rural farmhouse or a bustling city dwelling. Over the years, as members marry, are born, and pass away, locks of their hair are carefully collected. The women of the family gather, sharing stories and memories as they work together, adding new blossoms of brown, blonde, silver, auburn hair to the ever-growing family wreath. This wreath, eventually completed and placed under its protective glass dome, becomes a silent, beautiful chronicle of their shared history, a memento mori that is also a testament to enduring lineage. We can also imagine a soldier going off to war, leaving his sweetheart with a locket containing his hair and carrying one with hers. These pieces would serve as vital emotional anchors during their separation, symbols of hope for reunion. Or think of two school friends pledging eternal friendship, exchanging small brooches, each containing a neatly plaited lock of the other's hair, a promise to remember each other always, whatever paths their lives might take. Queen Victoria herself, after Prince Albert's death in 1861, commissioned numerous pieces of mourning jewelry containing his hair. One famous example is a gold and black enamel bracelet with a miniature portrait of Albert on one side of the clasp and a lock of his hair on the other. He wore such items constantly, and her devotion to his memory, expressed through these tangible tokens, deeply influenced the mourning fashions of her era, solidifying hairwork's place as a primary medium for remembrance. These are the kinds of human stories woven into the very strands of Victorian hair art. Each piece, whether humble or grand, was a vessel for profound emotion, a labor-intensive act of love, and a deeply personal way of saying, "I will not forget you." The anonymity of many of these pieces today does not diminish their power. It only invites us to imagine the lives and emotions they once represented. The decline of hairwork. Despite its immense popularity throughout much of the 19th century, the intricate art of hairwork began to decline towards the end of the Victorian era and into the early 20th century. Several factors contributed to this shift. Fashions, as they always do, began to change. The heavy, elaborate styles of the mid-Victorian period gave way to simpler, less ornate aesthetics in the Edwardian era and beyond. The very public and prolonged nature of Victorian mourning also started to come under criticism. Some viewed it as overly ostentatious or even insincere. As societal attitudes towards grief began to evolve, becoming more private and less ritualized, the demand for such elaborate and visible tokens of mourning lessened. Furthermore, the sheer scale of loss during World War I-B, 1B, 14, 19, 18 had a profound impact. The collective grief was so immense, so overwhelming, that the older, more individualized and elaborate mourning customs seemed inadequate or even inappropriate. Mass death necessitated different, perhaps simpler, forms of remembrance. The resources and appetite for such labor-intensive crafts also diminished in wartime and its aftermath. While the practice of keeping a lock of hair as a memento never entirely disappeared, the creation of intricate hair jewelry and large-scale hair art largely faded from popular culture. What was once a common skill and a widely understood form of sentimental expression became a more niche historical curiosity. Today, these pieces are primarily found in museums or antique collections, admired for their craftsmanship and their poignant connection to the past. Conclusion: a lasting imprint. The Victorian art of hair, in all its intricate and varied forms, stands as a remarkable testament to the human need to connect, to remember, and to find tangible ways to cope with love and loss. It was far more than just a curious craft or a passing fashion. It was a deeply embedded cultural practice, a visual and tactile language of the heart. Each woven strand, each carefully placed curl, was imbued with profound personal meaning, a labor-intensive act of devotion. These intimate keepsakes fashioned from the very stuff of life allowed Victorians to hold on to a physical part of those they cherished, whether living or deceased. In an age of high mortality and deeply felt sentiment, hair art provided a unique and powerful way to bridge the gap between presence and absence, to make memory almost palpable. It was a Memento Mori that was also, paradoxically, a vibrant affirmation of enduring bond. While the intricate skills of the Victorian hair artist are largely lost to common practice today, the objects themselves remain. They offer us a quiet, deeply personal window into the emotional landscape of the 19th century, reminding us that despite the passage of time and the shifts in cultural norms, the fundamental human experiences of love, grief, and the desire to remember remain constant. These delicate relics, woven from sorrow and affection, leave a lasting imprint, a soft whisper from the past about the enduring power of human connection. We now arrive at perhaps one of the most debated, and to contemporary eyes, often most unsettling, aspects of Victorian mourning customs: the practice of post-mortem photography. In this chapter, titled Post-Mortem Photography, Freezing Time, we will gently draw back the curtain on these enigmatic images. While today they might evoke a sense of unease, a visceral reaction that labels them creepy or macabre for many Victorians, these photographs were deeply cherished, profoundly meaningful, and an essential part of navigating the all-too-common, all-too-painful experience of loss. Their purpose was not to shock, but to soothe. Not to dwell on death, but to preserve a fragile memory of life. It's important to acknowledge at the outset the discomfort these images can provoke in a modern audience. Our 21st century sensibilities are often far removed from the daily realities of death that pervaded Victorian life. We live in a culture that largely shields itself from the direct sight of mortality, where death is often medicalized, occurring in sterile institutions, and its visual representations are kept intensely private or are heavily mediated through news or fiction. To see a photograph of someone deceased, particularly a child, posed with such deliberate care can feel jarring, even intrusive, triggering a sense of transgression against modern taboos. But to understand the Victorians and the solace they found in these images, we must try to see these photographs through their eyes, within the specific context of their time. The rise of post-mortem photography in the 19th century was intrinsically and inextricably linked to the birth and rapid evolution of photography itself. When Louis Daguerre's astonishing process was announced to an amazed world in 1839, it was nothing short of revolutionary. It felt almost like magic. For the first time in human history, a perfect, minutely detailed likeness of a person, a place, or a scene could be captured and preserved with relative speed and uncanny accuracy. It was hailed with a sense of awe as a mirror with a memory, a remarkable, almost supernatural ability to freeze a fleeting moment, to hold onto an exact reflection of reality. Before the advent of photography, the only way to capture a visual likeness was through painting, drawing, or sculpture. These were services that were invariably expensive, time-consuming, and generally accessible only to the affluent echelons of society. A painted portrait miniature, for example, requiring the skill of a talented artist and considerable financial investment, was a luxury far beyond the reach of most. Photography, even in its earliest, somewhat cumbersome forms, offered a comparatively more democratic means of obtaining a portrait. While still not inexpensive in its initial years, it was significantly more affordable and considerably quicker to produce than a commissioned painting or drawing, bringing the possibility of a lasting image to a broader public. This groundbreaking new technology arrived and flourished in an era, as we have previously discussed in this series, where death was a frequent, unwelcome, yet undeniably present visitor in almost every household. Infant and child mortality rates were tragically, staggeringly high. Diseases like tuberculosis, the White Plague, cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, and scarlet fever claimed lives with a relentless and often swift regularity. For many families, particularly those of modest means, the devastating death of a loved one, especially a cherished child, might occur before any formal portrait had ever been made of them while they were alive. There might have been no casual sketches, no saved silhouettes, nothing visual to cling to. In this poignant context, the newly invented photograph offered a precious, almost miraculous last opportunity, a chance to capture a final true image, a faithful likeness, to be treasured when all other physical presence was gone. The primary intent behind the burgeoning practice of post-mortem photography was, therefore, rarely a morbid fascination with death itself, nor was it an attempt to shock or disturb. It was born from a deep, fundamental human desire to remember, to preserve the precious image of a loved one, and to possess a tangible memento that could aid in the complex, painful process of grieving. For many, it was the only opportunity to possess such a powerful keepsake. The prevailing Victorian ideal of the beautiful death, or good death, also played a significant role in shaping the aesthetic and acceptance of these images. Influenced heavily by the Romantic movement's sentimentalism and the pervasive evangelical Christian beliefs of the era, this ideal envisioned a peaceful, tranquil passing, ideally surrounded by loving family members, with the deceased appearing serene, as if merely fallen into a gentle sleep. Post-mortem photographs often aim to capture precisely this sense of peaceful repose, offering a measure of comfort to the bereaved by visually affirming that their loved one was at rest, free from worldly suffering. The earliest popular photographic process, the daguerreotype, introduced in 1839, produced a unique, incredibly detailed, and almost ethereal image on a polished, silver-plated copper sheet. These images were renowned for their sharpness and the almost luminous quality of their tones, often described as a mirror with a memory, because of their reflective surface. Viewing a daguerreotype was an intimate act. The image shifted and changed with the light and angle of viewing. Each daguerreotype was a one-of-a-kind object, as no direct negatives were involved, which made it incredibly precious and a fitting medium for such a singular, final portrait. The minute detail they could capture made them particularly suited for memorial portraits, preserving every discernible feature of a beloved face. As the 19th century progressed, other photographic processes emerged, making photography more accessible and versatile. Ambrotypes, which were collodion-positive images on glass, backed with a dark material, became popular from the mid-1000s. 850s tintypes, or phototypes, created on a thin, black lacquered iron plate, offered an even more affordable and durable option. These were generally less expensive and quicker to produce than daguerreotypes, making portraiture, including post-mortem photography, accessible to an even wider segment of the population. Like daguerreotypes, these images were also often housed in protective, ornamental cases or sometimes in special albums, signifying their value. Later still, the development of the wet collodion process and the subsequent advent of the carte de visite, a small albumen print mounted on a standardized piece of card, roughly the size of a visiting card, in the late high gains, 150s and 160s, truly democratized photography. Carte de visite were relatively inexpensive to produce, in multiples from a single glass negative. This meant families could not only have a memorial portrait but could also share copies with relatives and close friends who might live far away, extending the circle of remembrance and shared grief. This shareability enhanced their role as tokens of connection and collective memory. The process of creating a post-mortem photograph was, as one might imagine, a somber and delicate affair, requiring a particular kind of sensibility from the photographer. Photographers, sometimes itinerant craftsmen traveling from town to town, or those established in town or city studios, would be called to the home of the deceased. Less commonly, particularly in later years or in urban areas with established studios, the body might be carefully transported to the photographer's premises if circumstances allowed and the family desired it. It was a task that required not only considerable technical skill, given the limitations of early photography, but also a degree of empathy, discretion, and understanding of the family's raw grief. Great care was almost invariably taken in preparing the deceased for their final portrait. This was often a task undertaken by the female members of the family, a final act of loving service. The departed would typically be dressed in their best clothes or in a special burial gown or shroud. Their hair would be carefully arranged and their features composed to appear as peaceful and natural as possible. For infants and young children, this might mean being dressed in a pristine white christening gown, a frilled dress, or their Sunday best, often looking like a porcelain doll. The aim was always to present them in a way that was both respectful and evoked a sense of serene beauty, mitigating the harshness of death. The most common and widely accepted method of posing the deceased, particularly infants and children, was to make them appear as if they were peacefully asleep. This was the last sleep motif, deeply comforting to Victorian sensibilities as it aligned with the idea of death as a gentle slumber, a temporary rest before an anticipated awakening in the afterlife. The deceased might be laid in their own crib or bed, nestled amongst pillows and blankets, or on a sofa, their eyes closed, their limbs arranged in a natural, relaxed, resting position. This pose minimized the visual indicators of death and emphasized tranquility. Sometimes the deceased, particularly an adult, might be posed in a seated position, perhaps in a favored chair, as if in quiet contemplation. This required more elaborate, though usually unseen, support, such as hidden braces or stands, to maintain the posture during the long exposure times. The long exposures required by early photographic processes, ranging from several seconds to many minutes, depending on the available light and the specific chemical process, meant that any movement would result in a blurred image. This, paradoxically, made the deceased an ideal photographic subject in one respect, as they remained perfectly unnervingly still, ensuring a sharp final image. In group photographs featuring a deceased individual alongside living family members, it is often the living who appear slightly blurred from involuntary movements, a slight shift of posture, a blink of an eye, while the deceased person is rendered in sharp, unwavering focus. These images, where parents cradle their lost child one last time, or siblings gather solemnly around their departed brother or sister, are among the most profoundly poignant and emotionally charged examples of post-mortem photography. They underscore the child's, or adult's, integral place within the family unit, a visual testament to their belonging even in death. Props were frequently and thoughtfully used to enhance the composition, symbolism, and emotional resonance of the photograph. Flowers, traditional symbols of remembrance, beauty, and the brevity of earthly life, were often placed in the hands of the deceased, scattered on the bed or arranged nearby. A favorite toy, a cherished doll, a small book, or other personal items might be included with a child, poignantly referencing their interrupted life and innocent pastime. Religious symbols such as a crucifix, a rosary, or a prayer book might also be present, reflecting the family's faith and their hopes for the soul of the departed. The attempt to make the deceased appear as lifelike as possible, or at least to soften the appearance of death, sometimes extended to how their eyes were treated. While the vast majority of post-mortem photographs depict the subject with eyes peacefully closed, in some instances, efforts were made to create an illusion of wakefulness. This could involve carefully propping open the eyelids, though this was a difficult and not always successful endeavor, often resulting in an unnatural stare. More commonly, if an eyes-open effect was desired by the family, it was achieved by the photographer or a later artist hand-tinting the photograph, delicately painting pupils and highlights onto the surface of the developed image, or, more rarely, onto the glass negative before printing. This required considerable artistic skill to achieve a semblance of naturalism. Frames of deceased individuals being elaborately posed in unsupported standing positions as if alive are often exaggerated or based on misinterpretations of photographs of living people who merely appear stiff due to the very long exposure times and the visible or hidden supportive posing stands commonly used for all portrait subjects in early photography. True unassisted standing post-mortem poses are exceptionally rare and would have been technically extremely challenging. When individuals appear somewhat upright, they were almost certainly carefully supported by furniture, family members, or hidden apparatus. The primary aesthetic desired and achieved was almost always one of peaceful, eternal rest, rather than an uncanny imitation of active life. The photographer's studio, with its controlled lighting and backdrops, could be a site for these solemn sessions, but often for reasons of practicality, decorum, and profound sentiment, the photographs were taken within the deceased's home. This might be in the parlor, where wakes were often held, or even in the bedroom, sometimes in the very room where the person had passed away or where their body lay in state before the funeral. This familiar domestic setting could add another layer of intimacy and personal meaning to the final image, framing the departed within their everyday world one last time. For countless Victorian families, especially those from the working or lower middle class who could not afford painted portraits, a post-mortem photograph was often the only visual record they would ever possess of a child, a parent, or another beloved family member. In an era before the ubiquity of personal cameras and the culture of casual snapshots, many people, particularly those who died young or unexpectedly, simply never had the occasion or the means to have a formal portrait taken while alive. The post-mortem photograph, therefore, became an incredibly precious, irreplaceable memento. This single, often somber, yet profoundly valued image would be treasured for generations. It served as a vital tool for grieving, a focal point for memory, storytelling, and family history. Families would gaze upon these photographs, recall the brief life lived, share anecdotes and memories, and in doing so, keep the individual's presence alive within the family narrative. It was a tangible way of saying, with deep conviction, they were here, they were loved, they are not forgotten, they are still part of us. The photograph offered a tangible connection that could be held in the hand, perhaps kissed, wept over in private, displayed in the home, often in a special album, a prominent frame, or a locket, and shared with absent family members who could not attend the funeral. Looking at the peaceful, composed face, families could find a measure of comfort, reinforcing the prevalent idea that their loved one was free from pain and at rest, sleeping soundly before, as their faith often promised, a joyful resurrection. It was a visual confirmation of the good death, a final, serene image to hold on to amidst the turmoil of grief. It is precisely this profound intimacy with the image of the deceased, this direct and unflinching gaze upon death, that often creates the cultural chasm between Victorian acceptance and widespread modern discomfort. Today, the thought of commissioning such a photograph, of posing with a deceased family member for a final portrait, is, for many, almost inconceivable, perhaps even viewed as a violation of modern sensibilities surrounding death and dignity. Our cultural relationship with death and its depiction has shifted profoundly over the past century and a half. Several key factors contributed to this dramatic change in attitudes and practices. Sustained advances in medicine and public health throughout the 20th century dramatically lowered infant and child mortality rates in many parts of the world, and increased overall life expectancy. As a result, people began to live longer, and death became less of an everyday household occurrence. It transformed from a frequent familiar presence into something more associated with advanced age, and increasingly, something that happened away from the familiar surroundings of home, often in hospitals or specialized care facilities. This growing physical distance naturally led to a decreased societal familiarity and comfort with the physical realities of death. The rise and consolidation of the professional funeral industry also played a significant role in this transition. Gradually, the personal care of the deceased, the washing, dressing, and laying out of the body, was taken out of the hands of the family and became the responsibility of specialists, the undertakers or funeral directors. This medicalization and professionalization of death further removed it from direct personal experience for many individuals and families, creating a buffer between the bereaved and the deceased. Our visual culture also underwent a radical transformation. With the advent of more portable cameras, faster film, and eventually easy snapshot photography and digital imaging, photographs of living people became commonplace, almost ubiquitous. The urgent need to capture a final image lessened considerably when many living images of a person likely already existed or could be easily made throughout their lifetime. The post-mortem photograph lost its last chance imperative. Furthermore, societal attitudes towards privacy and the public display of grief evolved significantly. While Victorians engaged in very open, elaborate, and ritualized mourning practices, 20th and 21st century grief has often become a more private, internalized, and less overtly demonstrative affair. The direct, unvarnished depiction of death, as seen so clearly in post-mortem photography, came to be viewed by many as too raw, too intensely personal for widespread comfort, or even as an invasion of the sanctity of death and the privacy of grief. Yet, for the Victorians, these photographs were a normalized, accepted, and often essential part of the grieving process. Death was frequently encountered within the home. Families were intimately involved in the care of their dying and deceased relatives, and wakes were often held in the parlor with the body present. Children were not systematically shielded from these realities, but grew up understanding death as a natural, albeit deeply sorrowful and significant, part of the human life cycle. In such a context, a photograph of the departed was not shocking or taboo, but a natural extension of these intimate farewells and acts of remembrance. It is essential, therefore, when we encounter these images today to approach them not as examples of morbid curiosity or a ghoulish fascination with the macabre, but as profound expressions of loving remembrance, created within a specific cultural framework. The Victorians who commissioned, created, and cherished these photographs were not seeking to exploit death for shock value or perverse titillation. They were seeking solace, a way to keep the precious memory of their loved one from fading into oblivion, a way to affirm their enduring love and the profound significance of the life that had been lost. The photograph acted as a powerful, tangible substitute for the lost physical presence, a visual anchor in a sea of overwhelming grief. It allowed the bereaved to see their loved one again, to recall their exact features, to feel a continued, almost physical connection across the veil of death. In an era of strong and widespread spiritual beliefs, the image of a peacefully reposing body could also reinforce the deeply held idea of the soul being at rest, safe in God's care, awaiting a future resurrection and reunion. The photograph, in this profound sense, was a memento mori that simultaneously offered a tangible glimmer of hope and continuity. The practice of formal post-mortem photography, as a widespread custom, began to decline noticeably in the early decades of the 20th century. As photography became increasingly inexpensive and accessible to the general populace, more people had portraits taken throughout their lives, diminishing the last-chance urgency for many. The informal snapshot aesthetic began to replace the solemn formality of earlier studio and in-home portraiture. The immense, unprecedented casualties of World War I also brought about a significant shift in public mourning practices, moving away from some of the more elaborate and individualized Victorian customs towards simpler, perhaps more stoic and communal forms of remembrance. The sheer scale of loss made such individualized photographic memorials less central, While some cultures around the world continue traditions of photographing the deceased as part of their mourning and remembrance rituals, in mainstream Western society it has largely become a lost art, a practice viewed through a thick veil of historical distance and, often, profound misunderstanding. The images that remain from its heyday, however, provide an invaluable and deeply human insight into the emotional and social landscape of the past. In conclusion, when we encounter Victorian post-mortem photographs, these remarkable images that so powerfully and poignantly succeed in freezing time by capturing a final, fleeting moment, it is vital to approach them with empathy, with a willingness to understand their historical and cultural context. They are not merely creepy relics from a bygone era. They are poignant testaments to enduring love, devastating loss, and the universal human need to remember and to be remembered. They challenge our own cultural norms and anxieties surrounding death, and invite us to reflect on how different societies, in different times, have sought to make peace with mortality and to honor their dead. These photographs are invaluable historical documents not just of individuals preserved in silver and light, but of social customs, evolving technologies, artistic conventions, and deeply personal emotional landscapes. By understanding the true intent behind them, the profound desire to preserve a precious memory, to find tangible comfort in a cherished likeness, to keep a loved one symbolically close even after physical separation, we can move beyond our initial modern discomfort. We can then begin to appreciate their true significance as profound acts of love, courage, and remembrance undertaken in the very face of irreplaceable loss. They are a quiet, visual echo of Victorian hearts, reaching out to us across the separating years, speaking of a shared humanity in grief. In our journey through the Victorian landscape of grief and remembrance, we have explored the intimate rituals of mourning attire, the poignant keepsakes of hair and photography, and the deep-seated sentiment of Memento Mori. Now we turn our gaze outwards, to the very places where the Victorians laid their departed to rest, the grand, park-like cemeteries that became such a defining feature of the 19th century cityscape and its surrounding countryside. This chapter, The Rise of the Grand Cemetery, examines a profound shift in how society dealt with its dead, moving from cramped, unsanitary churchyards to sprawling, beautifully designed cities of the silent. For centuries, burial in Western Europe had predominantly taken place in the consecrated ground of local churchyards, often located in the heart of towns and villages. These were familiar, if often crowded, spaces. However, by the early 19th century, particularly in rapidly industrializing and expanding cities like London, Paris, and New York, these traditional burial grounds were facing a severe crisis. Populations were booming, and with them, mortality rates. The ancient churchyards simply could not cope. Imagine the scene. Small plots of land, used and reused over generations, becoming dangerously overcrowded. Graves were often shallow, leading to unpleasant sights and, more alarmingly, significant public health hazards. The air in densely populated urban areas was already compromised by industrial pollution and poor sanitation, and the noxious effluvia emanating from overflowing graveyards were increasingly, and correctly, seen as a serious threat, believed to contribute to the spread of diseases like cholera and typhoid, the dreaded miasma. The conditions were often grim. Decaying matter, disturbed by new interments, could contaminate water supplies. The sheer density of burials meant that older graves were frequently disrupted to make way for new ones, a practice that, while born of necessity, was deeply unsettling to the sensibilities of an era that increasingly valued dignified and lasting remembrance. A radical solution was urgently needed, not just for sanitary reasons, but also to satisfy a growing desire for more respectful and permanent resting places. Thus began the great cemetery movement of the 19th century. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals of order and reason, the burgeoning romantic appreciation for nature and picturesque landscapes, and a pressing need for reform, visionaries began to advocate for the creation of large, purpose-built cemeteries located on the outskirts of urban centers. These would not be the grim, chaotic plots of old, but carefully planned, spacious, and aesthetically pleasing environments. Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, established in 1804, became a highly influential early model. Its park-like design, with winding paths, abundant trees, and elaborate artistic monuments, set a new standard. It demonstrated that a burial ground could be a place of beauty, dignity, and even a destination for reflective walks. This vision soon spread across Europe and to North America, leading to the establishment of what became known as rural cemeteries or garden cemeteries. In London, this movement led to the creation of the Magnificent Seven, a ring of large private cemeteries encircling the metropolis, including Kensal Green, 1833, Highgate, 1839, Abney Park, 1840, and others. These were ambitious projects, often established by commercial companies, designed not only to alleviate the sanitary crisis, but also to cater to the burgeoning middle and upper classes who desired grander, more permanent memorials than the old churchyards could offer. The purpose of these new cemeteries was therefore twofold. Firstly, and most pressingly, they were a sanitary solution. By moving burials away from densely populated areas and into spacious, well-drained grounds, they aimed to protect public health and create a more hygienic environment for the living. The scale of these new cemeteries allowed for individual plots that would not be disturbed, offering a sense of perpetual care. Secondly, and equally importantly, these grand cemeteries became vast outdoor arenas for the expression of Victorian sentimentality, piety, and undeniably social status. They provided a new stage upon which families could demonstrate their wealth, taste, and devotion to their deceased loved ones through the commissioning of elaborate and often costly monuments. The era of the simple headstone for all but the very wealthy was giving way to a new age of funerary art. Walking through a Victorian cemetery today is like stepping into an open-air museum of 19th century sculpture and architecture. The sheer variety and scale of the memorials are astounding. Families vied, consciously or unconsciously, to create the most impressive tributes. Tall, soaring obelisks, inspired by ancient Egyptian forms and symbolizing eternity, or a ray of sunlight, became immensely popular. Intricately carved Celtic crosses spoke to heritage and faith. Grand family mausoleums, resembling small temples or chapels, were constructed by wealthier families, providing a final resting place for multiple generations. These structures, built from enduring materials like granite and marble, were often adorned with stained glass, mosaic floors, and heavy bronze doors, becoming imposing statements of dynastic pride and earthly success, even in death. Statuary abounded. Life-sized or larger-than-life figures of angels, often depicted in attitudes of grief, prayer, or guidance, were incredibly common. Weeping female figures, draped in classical robes, leaned sorrowfully against tombs or urns, personifying grief itself. Portraits, busts, or even full-figure statues of the deceased themselves, sometimes depicted in their professional attire or engaged in a characteristic activity, also became fashionable. The materials used for these monuments spoke of permanence and prestige. Polished granite in various hues, gray, red, black, was favored for its durability. White Carrara marble, though susceptible to weathering, was prized for its purity and suitability for delicate carving, especially for figures of children or angels. Bronze was used for plaques, doors, and sculptural elements, adding a rich, dark contrast. Beyond the sheer scale and artistry of the monuments, Victorian cemeteries are rich tapestries of symbolism, a silent language in stone designed to convey complex messages about life, death, faith, and remembrance. Each motif was carefully chosen, carrying layers of meaning understood by contemporary visitors. Understanding this symbolism unlocks a deeper appreciation of these intricate memorials. Angels, as mentioned, were perhaps the most ubiquitous figures. A trumpeting angel could signify the call to resurrection on Judgment Day. An angel pointing upwards directed thoughts towards heaven. A gently weeping angel conveyed sorrow but also divine comfort. They were seen as guardians of the grave and messengers between heaven and earth, embodying the Victorian era's deep Christian faith. The urn, a classical symbol often seen in Georgian funerary art, continued its popularity into the Victorian era. It represented the mortal remains, the body as a vessel. Often the urn was depicted as draped with a cloth or shroud, symbolizing the veil between life and death, or the mantle of sorrow. If the urn was shown with a flame, it could symbolize the eternal flame of the spirit, or the fires of purification. A broken column or a tree stump cut short was a poignant symbol for a life interrupted, particularly the death of someone in their youth or the prime of life. The head of a family, or someone whose work was left unfinished. It spoke of potential, unfulfilled, and the suddenness of loss. Clasped hands were another common motif, often representing the marital bond and the hope of reunion in the afterlife, or a final farewell. Look closely at the cuffs. A frilly cuff often denoted a woman's hand, a plain one, a man's. Floral symbolism, so prevalent in Victorian culture generally, was also intricately carved onto tombstones. Roses in their many forms typically signified love, hope, or beauty. A rosebud often marked the grave of a child or young person, its life nipped before it could fully bloom. Lilies represented purity, majesty, and the resurrection. Ivy, in evergreen, symbolized eternity, fidelity, and undying remembrance, often shown clinging to a cross or column. Forget-me-nots were a direct plea for continued memory. Animals also played their part in this symbolic lexicon. The lamb, as we've noted, was the most common symbol for the grave of an infant or young child, representing innocence, gentleness, and Christ, the Lamb of God. A dove, often shown descending, could symbolize the Holy Spirit, peace, or the soul's journey to heaven. Even a dog carved at the foot of a grave could represent faithfulness and loyalty. Other common symbols included the open book, often representing the Bible, or the Book of Life, with the individual's deeds recorded within. An anchor signified hope and steadfastness, particularly Christian hope and salvation. An inverted torch represented life extinguished, while an upright torch could symbolize eternal life or the light of the Spirit. The hourglass, with its sands run out, was a direct memento mori, a reminder of time's passage. These grand cemeteries, with their park-like settings and artistic monuments, quickly became more than just places of burial. They evolved into popular destinations for the living. In an era before widespread public parks in many cities, these beautifully landscaped cities of the dead offered a rare opportunity for town dwellers to experience nature, fresh air, or at least fresher than in the city center, and quiet contemplation. Families would make regular visits to the graves of their loved ones, often on Sundays or anniversaries. These visits were not necessarily solely mournful occasions. They involved tending to the grave, planting flowers, perhaps cleaning the headstone, and spending time in quiet remembrance. It was a way of maintaining a continued relationship with the deceased, of keeping their memory integrated into family life. Strolling through the winding paths of Highgate or Kensal Green became a respectable, even fashionable, Sunday pastime. People would promenade along the avenues, admiring the elaborate monuments, reflecting on the inscriptions, and enjoying the carefully cultivated scenery. For many, these cemeteries served as outdoor art galleries and botanical gardens, offering both aesthetic pleasure and moral instruction. The Victorians believed that contemplating mortality in such a beautiful and ordered setting could be spiritually uplifting. There was also a social dimension to these visits. Cemeteries became places to see and be seen, to subtly display one's family piety and social standing through the grandeur of one's ancestral plot and the diligence of its upkeep. Guidebooks were published for the larger cemeteries, highlighting notable monuments and the graves of famous individuals, further encouraging tourism and visitation. In essence, the Victorian Grand Cemetery was a multi-layered space. It was a practical solution to a public health crisis, a testament to artistic and engineering skill, a public park, a school for moral and religious reflection, a display of social hierarchy, and, above all, a deeply sentimental landscape dedicated to the art of remembrance. It was a place where the Victorian fascination with Memento Mori found its most expansive and enduring physical expression. The legacy of these magnificent 19th century cemeteries endures to this day. Many are now cherished historic sites, valued for their unique architecture, their rich social history, and their tranquil, often overgrown beauty. They remain powerful landscapes of memory, reflecting the complex attitudes of the Victorians towards death, their deep grief, their desire for lasting remembrance, their anxieties about salvation, and their attempts to find beauty and order even in the face of mortality. These grand cemeteries stand as a quiet, stone-carved testament to an era that did not shy away from confronting death, but sought instead to integrate it into the fabric of life, creating spaces where the departed were not forgotten, but remained a visible, honored part of the community. They are, in their own way, a form of boring history that, upon closer inspection, reveals a world of profound emotion, artistic expression, and enduring human connection, inviting us to wander their paths and reflect. Throughout our quiet journey into the heart of Victorian mourning, we've seen how societal norms, religious beliefs, and the ever-present reality of death shaped an elaborate culture of remembrance. In this chapter, Victoria's enduring influence, we turn to a singular figure whose personal sorrow cast an incredibly long and pervasive shadow, profoundly shaping the mourning customs of an entire era. Queen Victoria herself. Her grief, monumental and unyielding, became a public touchstone, solidifying and even intensifying the very practices we have been exploring. The story of Queen Victoria's impact on mourning etiquette is inextricably linked to one devastating event: the untimely death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert. When Albert, the prince consort, died of typhoid fever in December 1861, at the relatively young age of 42, the Queen was plunged into an abyss of grief. from which, in many ways, she never fully emerged. Theirs had been a deep and devoted partnership, and his loss was not just a personal tragedy for Victoria, but a seismic event for the nation. Immediately following Albert's death, Queen Victoria retreated into a profound and all-encompassing state of mourning. This was not a grief that was hidden away or quietly endured. It was a sorrow that consumed her public and private life. She famously wore black for the remaining 40 years of her reign, earning her the enduring epithet the Widow of Windsor. Her dedication to Albert's memory was absolute, and her mourning became a defining characteristic of her long rule. This royal sorrow was highly visible, despite her withdrawal from many aspects of public life for a considerable period. Her black attire, the somber atmosphere of her court, and a relentless dedication to memorializing Albert were constantly before her subjects. She commissioned numerous statues, monuments, and buildings in his honor, the most famous being the magnificent Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, and the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, where he was interred. These grand gestures served as constant public reminders of her enduring love and loss. Because the Queen was the head of state, the apex of society, her personal conduct inevitably set a powerful national example. Her intense and prolonged mourning for Prince Albert did not introduce new customs out of thin air. Many of the elements of Victorian mourning etiquette were already in place, but her unwavering adherence to them and the sheer scale of her grief lent them an unprecedented level of authority and fashionability. If the Queen herself embraced such deep and lasting sorrow, it became the aspirational standard for her subjects. The rules of mourning, which we have discussed in previous chapters, the specific stages, the prescribed fabrics like crepe, the use of jet jewelry, the restrictions on social life were all amplified and solidified by the Queen's example. What might have been considered appropriate for the upper echelons of society increasingly became the expected norm for the burgeoning middle classes, who looked to the monarchy for cues on proper conduct and refined sensibility. Her visible grief made deep mourning not just a personal response, but a public virtue. The cult of mourning, already a significant feature of Victorian society, was undoubtedly intensified by the Queen's actions. The demand for black clothing, mourning crepe, itself an uncomfortable and expensive fabric, and jet ornaments surged. An entire industry catered to the elaborate requirements of bereavement, and the Queen's steadfast adherence to these sartorial symbols provided a constant, high-profile endorsement. Her choices resonated through every level of society that could afford to emulate them, making the outward display of grief more widespread and often more rigid for decades. Even those who may not have personally felt inclined towards such elaborate displays found themselves under societal pressure to conform, partly out of respect for the Queen's own profound sorrow and partly due to the prevailing sentiment that such observances were a mark of good character and proper feeling. The Queen's grief was, in a sense, the nation's grief, and her example permeated the collective consciousness, shaping how individuals understood and expressed their own losses. Even the smallest details of mourning stationery or the etiquette of condolence visits took on a greater weight under her influence. Thus, the image of Queen Victoria, perpetually clad in widow's weeds, became an enduring symbol of the era. Her personal tragedy and her response to it inadvertently set a tone for much of her reign, reinforcing an already somber aspect of Victorian culture. While some historians suggest that the intensity of mourning customs might have eventually waned on its own, Victoria's powerful example undoubtedly prolonged and deepened their hold on society, ensuring that these elaborate rituals of sorrow remained a central part of British life for much of the 19th century. In conclusion, Queen Victoria's enduring influence on mourning customs cannot be overstated. Her profound personal grief for Prince Albert, displayed so publicly and maintained so steadfastly for 4 decades, transformed her into the ultimate exemplar of the bereaved widow. By her example, she not only adhered to the existing practices, but also imbued them with a new level of solemnity and societal expectation, ensuring that the intricate and often burdensome etiquette of Victorian sorrow would leave an indelible mark on the history of remembrance. Our journey through the quiet, shadowed world of Victorian grief now draws to a close. We've seen how they navigated profound loss, through the strictures of mourning etiquette, the poignant symbolism of Memento Mori, the delicate, loving artistry of human hair woven into precious keepsakes, and the stark, often heartbreaking, finality captured in post-mortem photography. To our modern eyes, accustomed to a different way of confronting mortality, some of these practices may indeed seem unsettling, perhaps even landing in the realm of the creepy. Yet it's crucial to remember that beneath this surface, which we might perceive as macabre, lies a testament to intense love, profound faith, and a societal relationship with death that was far more integrated and visible than our own often is today. Their elaborate rituals and sometimes startling art were not born of a morbid curiosity, but from a deep-seated need to grapple with an undeniable aspect of life. Instead, these varied and often labor-intensive practices represented a profound, deeply human attempt to keep the departed close, to make memory tangible, to give sorrow a form and a voice in a world where loss was an ever-present, frequent companion. Their ways were different, certainly, perhaps even alien to our contemporary sensibilities, which often seek to shield us from death's direct gaze and to privatize grief. But the underlying human emotion, the ache of bereavement, the yearning to remember and to honor those who have passed, is a timeless and universal thread connecting all humanity. Across every era and in every culture, people have found diverse, heartfelt, and often intricate paths to navigate the sorrow of parting, each expression valid and meaningful in its own time and place, each a whisper of love against the silence of eternity.